Celebration turned to chaos. When she arrived behind enemy lines with full arsenal, Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her brow as she adjusted her tactical vest one final time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base in Afghanistan, where she had spent the last 18 months serving as a weapons specialist with the 82nd Airborne Division. Today was supposed to be different. Today was supposed to be a celebration. The entire forward operating base buzzed with excitement. After months of successful missions and 0 casualties in their sector, Command had approved a rare morale event. Local Afghan officials were coming to the base for a cultural exchange ceremony, complete with traditional music, food, and demonstrations of military equipment. Sarah had been chosen to lead the weapons demonstration, showcasing the advanced arsenal that had kept their units safe. She walked through the armory, mentally cataloging each piece of equipment. The M4 carbines gleamed under the fluorescent lights, their barrels recently cleaned and inspected. Boxes of ammunition sat neatly stacked, each one accounted for in her meticulous inventory system. The heavier weapons occupied their own section: grenade launchers, squad automatic weapons, and the specialized equipment that had earned her reputation as one of the most knowledgeable weapons experts in the division. Lieutenant Colonel Davis approached her station, his usually stern expression softened by what appeared to be genuine pride. Sarah had served under Davis since arriving in country, and their professional relationship had evolved into mutual respect built on her consistent performance and attention to detail. "Martinez, everything ready for the dog and pony show?" Davis asked, using the military slang for demonstration events. His tone suggested he shared the common soldier's mild skepticism about such ceremonies. But Sarah knew he understood their importance for maintaining relationships with local leadership. "Yes, sir. All weapons accounted for and demonstration materials prepared. The locals should get a good look at our capabilities without compromising operational security." Sarah's response was crisp and professional, masking her own mixed feelings about the event. The celebration was scheduled to begin at 1400 hours. Local tribal leaders, government officials, and interpreters would arrive via convoy from the nearby city. The base commander had spent weeks coordinating with Afghan security forces to ensure safe passage. Intelligence reports indicated minimal threat levels in the area, with recent insurgent activity focused on regions much farther south. As Sarah continued her preparations, she couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something felt different about today. Her instincts, honed by months of combat operations, seemed to be sending subtle warnings that she couldn't quite identify. The morning briefing had mentioned increased radio chatter in local networks, but intelligence officers had dismissed it as routine communication related to the day's events. Sergeant Williams joined her at the weapons display area, carrying additional demonstration materials. Williams had been her closest friend since basic training, and their partnership had proven invaluable during their deployment. His easy smile and quick humor provided perfect balance to Sarah's more serious demeanor. "You nervous about performing for the brass and the locals?" Williams asked, beginning to arrange the display materials according to their predetermined layout. "This is a pretty big deal. Word is some important people are coming, including that district governor who's been pushing for more cooperation between our forces and local security," Sarah considered, his question while adjusting the positioning of several weapons on their display table. Nervousness wasn't quite the right word for what she was feeling. After 18 months of real combat operations, a controlled demonstration seemed almost routine. But the responsibility of representing American military capability to Afghan officials carried its own weight. The base had transformed over the past few days. Maintenance crews had worked overtime to ensure everything looked perfect. The dining facility had prepared special meals featuring both American and Afghan cuisine. Cultural advisors had briefed all participating personnel on appropriate protocols for interacting with local officials. Even the often cynical enlisted soldiers seemed genuinely excited about the break from routine patrols and security operations. Sarah's radio crackled with routine traffic as various units reported their readiness status. The perimeter security teams confirmed their positions. The convoy escort teams were staging for departure to meet the incoming Afghan officials. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to plan, yet her unease continued to grow. She decided to conduct one final check of her personal equipment, Her sidearm was properly holstered and secured. Her tactical gear was arranged for quick access if needed, though such precautions seemed almost paranoid given the controlled nature of the day's events. The base was secure, surrounded by multiple layers of defense and staffed with experienced soldiers who had successfully operated in this environment for months. The weapons she would be demonstrating represented the cutting edge of American military technology. Each piece had been selected not only for its effectiveness, but also for the message it would send about American commitment to supporting Afghan security forces. The demonstration would show Afghan officials the quality of equipment that successful cooperation might eventually make available to their own forces. As noon approached, Sarah noticed increased activity around the base perimeter. Additional security teams had been positioned at key points, and the quick reaction force had been placed on standby. These were standard precautions for any event involving high-value visitors, but they also served as reminders that even during celebrations, they remained in a combat zone. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was preparing to showcase instruments of war during what was meant to be a peaceful cultural exchange. But this was the reality of military service in a conflict zone. Building relationships with local populations required demonstrating both the capability and restraint that defined professional military forces. Her final equipment check revealed everything in perfect order. The weapons were clean, the ammunition properly stored, and the demonstration materials arranged for maximum impact. Sarah felt confident in her preparation, even as that persistent unease continued to gnaw at the edges of her consciousness. The celebration was about to begin, but Sarah Martinez had no idea that within hours, her careful preparations and extensive training would be tested in ways she never imagined. The very weapons she was preparing to demonstrate in a peaceful ceremony would soon become the tools of her survival when celebration suddenly transformed into chaos, and she found herself operating behind enemy lines with nothing but her skills and her full arsenal to keep her alive. Celebration turned to chaos when she arrived behind enemy lines with full arsenal. The convoy of Afghan officials arrived precisely at 1400 hours, their vehicles kicking up clouds of dust as they passed through the main gate. Sarah watched from her demonstration area as the local dignitaries emerged from their armored vehicles, dressed in traditional robes and Western business suits. The contrast between their formal attire and the military environment created an almost surreal atmosphere. District Governor Hamid Karzai stepped out first, a tall man with a carefully groomed beard and intelligent eyes that immediately began assessing his surroundings. Behind him came tribal elders, local police commanders, and several interpreters who would facilitate communication throughout the event. Their presence represented months of diplomatic effort to build stronger relationships between American forces and local leadership. The ceremony began with formal greetings and speeches, translated between English and Dari. Base Commander Colonel Richardson delivered remarks emphasizing the shared commitment to peace and security in the region. Governor Karzai responded with gracious words about cooperation and mutual respect. The atmosphere was cordial, even warm, as both sides seemed genuinely committed to building positive relationships. Sarah's demonstration was scheduled for mid-afternoon, allowing time for the meal and cultural presentations. She used the opportunity to observe the Afghan officials, trying to gauge their interests and adjust her presentation accordingly. Several seemed particularly interested in the technical aspects of American equipment, asking detailed questions through interpreters about capabilities and training requirements. The dining facility had outdone itself preparing for the occasion. Tables groaned under the weight of both American and Afghan dishes, carefully prepared to accommodate dietary restrictions and cultural preferences. The smell of grilled meat and traditional spices filled the air, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a festival than a military base in a combat zone. During the meal, Sarah found herself seated near several Afghan police commanders who spoke broken English. Their conversation revealed genuine curiosity about American training methods and equipment. One commander, Captain Nazir, had studied in Pakistan and spoke excellent English. He peppered her with questions about weapons maintenance and logistics, displaying knowledge that impressed her with its depth and practical focus. In my district, we have many problems with weapons maintenance, Captain Nazir explained between bites of lamb and rice. Our men are brave, but they lack proper training with modern equipment. Perhaps your demonstration today will show us new methods we can adopt. Sarah appreciated his directness and obvious commitment to improving his force's capabilities. These were the kinds of conversations that made such events worthwhile, building understanding between professionals who faced similar challenges in different contexts. She found herself looking forward to showing these men equipment that might genuinely help them protect their communities. As the meal concluded, traditional Afghan musicians began playing in one corner of the dining facility. The haunting melodies of traditional instruments created an otherworldly atmosphere, transporting everyone present far from the harsh realities of military life. Several American soldiers listened with obvious fascination, while Afghan officials smiled with pride at sharing their cultural heritage. Sarah excused herself to make final preparations for her demonstration. The afternoon heat was building, and she wanted to ensure all equipment remained in optimal condition. As she walked toward the armory, she noticed increased radio traffic from the perimeter security teams. The chatter seemed routine, but something about the frequency and tone caught her attention. Staff Sergeant Johnson approached her with a slight frown creasing his weathered features. Johnson was the senior non-commissioned officer responsible for base security, and his instincts had proven reliable throughout their deployment. His expression suggested he was processing information that didn't quite fit expected patterns. "Martinez, you picking up anything unusual on the nets?" Johnson asked, referring to the radio networks that connected all base security elements. "We're getting reports of increased vehicle movement in several areas around the base perimeter. Could be nothing, but the pattern seems a bit off for normal traffic." Sarah paused her equipment check to consider Johnson's observation. Increased vehicle movement wasn't necessarily alarming in itself. Local populations routinely adjusted their travel patterns around military activities, sometimes gathering to observe events at the base. But Johnson's instincts had kept them alive through numerous situations, and she had learned to take his concerns seriously. "What kind of pattern are you seeing?" she asked, her own unease beginning to crystallize around his observations. "Single vehicles or groups? Any indication of weapons or unusual behavior?" Johnson consulted his notepad, where he had been tracking the reports. Multiple reports of small groups, 2 to 3 vehicles each, positioning themselves at various points around our perimeter. Not close enough to be immediate threats, but close enough to observe our activities. The timing coincides with the arrival of our guests, which could be coincidence or coordination. The implications of coordinated observation were obvious to both soldiers. If insurgent forces were positioning themselves to monitor the base during the celebration, it could indicate planning for future attacks or immediate hostile action. Either possibility required heightened vigilance and potentially defensive preparations. Sarah decided to accelerate her demonstration timeline while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. The last thing anyone wanted was to create unnecessary alarm during a diplomatic event. But prudent precautions seemed warranted given Johnson's observations and her own growing unease. She returned to the celebration area, where the cultural program was reaching its peak. Afghan and American soldiers were attempting to learn each other's traditional dances, creating moments of genuine laughter and connection that embodied the event's intended spirit. Governor Karzai was deep in conversation with Colonel Richardson about future cooperation possibilities. The scene represented everything positive about international partnership efforts, but beneath the surface camaraderie, Sarah noticed subtle signs that other military personnel were also becoming more alert. Security teams were checking their equipment more frequently. Radio operators were maintaining closer contact with perimeter positions. The quick reaction force had quietly moved to more advantageous positions without disrupting the celebration. Captain Nazir approached her as she prepared to begin the weapons demonstration. His earlier friendliness remained, but she detected a new tension in his demeanor that suggested he too was sensing changes in the atmosphere. "Sergeant Martinez, I am very much looking forward to your demonstration," he said, but his eyes were scanning the area around them rather than focusing on her equipment. "My men have much to learn from American methods, but perhaps we should begin soon. The afternoon grows late and travel after dark can be problematic." His subtle suggestion of urgency aligned with her own instincts. Whatever was developing around the base perimeter seemed to be building towards something, and completing their official business quickly might be prudent for everyone's safety. Sarah nodded and began arranging her demonstration materials for immediate presentation. She had no way of knowing that within minutes, The celebration would transform into chaos, and her carefully prepared weapons demonstration would become a desperate fight for survival that would test every skill she had learned in 18 months of combat operations. Celebration turned to chaos. When she arrived behind enemy lines with full arsenal, the first mortar round struck the base perimeter at exactly 15:37 hours, just as Sarah was explaining the technical specifications of the M4 carbine to a group of fascinated Afghan officials. The explosion shattered the afternoon calm like thunder, sending everyone diving for cover as debris rained down from the damaged guard tower. Chaos erupted instantly. The carefully orchestrated celebration transformed into a nightmare of shouting voices, running figures, and the distinctive crack of incoming rifle fire. Sarah's training kicked in automatically as she pushed Governor Karzai behind the concrete barriers that had been positioned around the demonstration area, her mind racing to assess the tactical situation developing around them. Contact, contact, contact. Staff Sergeant Johnson's voice boomed across the base communication system. Multiple positions engaging from the north and east perimeters. We have effective fire on the main compound. QRF deploy immediately. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, securing the weapons that had been on display and grabbing her personal gear. The celebration had been staged in an open area that provided excellent visibility for demonstrations, but offered minimal protection during an actual firefight. She needed to get the Afghan officials to a more defensible position while maintaining her own ability to respond to the attack. Captain Nazir had also reacted with professional competence, drawing his sidearm and helping to organize the protection of the other Afghan officials. His earlier nervousness now made perfect sense. His instincts had detected the same warning signs that had been troubling Sarah and Johnson throughout the afternoon. How many attackers? Captain Nazir shouted over the increasing volume of gunfire, his English remaining clear despite the stress of combat. Can your forces contain them, or do we need to prepare for evacuation? Before Sarah could respond, a second wave of mortar rounds impacted closer to their position. The explosions were getting more accurate, indicating the attackers had pre-planned their firing positions and had been observing the base layout carefully. This wasn't a random assault, but a coordinated attack designed to maximize damage during the high-value gathering. Lieutenant Colonel Davis appeared through the smoke and confusion, his tactical gear hastily thrown over his dress uniform. His face was grim as he assessed the situation around the demonstration area, clearly calculating the risks of having so many important people exposed in a relatively open space. Martinez, we need to move these people to the hardened bunkers immediately, Davis ordered, his voice cutting through the noise of battle. The attack is coordinated and they seem to know exactly where we are. Intel was wrong about threat levels today. Sarah began organizing the movement of Afghan officials toward the nearest hardened position, but the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy fire was intensifying from multiple directions, and the distinctive sound of rocket-propelled grenades added a new dimension to the threat. The attackers were well-equipped and clearly intended to inflict maximum casualties. As they moved toward cover, Sarah caught sight of the base's defensive response developing. American soldiers were manning fighting positions along the perimeter, their return fire disciplined and effective. The quick reaction force was deploying toward the heaviest contact areas, while medical teams were already responding to the first casualties from the initial mortar strikes. But something was wrong with the enemy attack pattern. Instead of focusing their assault on military targets, significant firepower seemed to be directed toward the celebration area where the Afghan officials were gathered. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't just an attack on the American base. It was specifically designed to eliminate the Afghan leadership that had come for the cultural exchange. They're targeting the officials, she shouted to Davis over the noise of battle. This whole thing was planned to take out Governor Karzai and the others. The celebration was a setup. Davis's expression darkened as he processed the implications. If the attackers succeeded in killing prominent Afghan officials during an American-hosted event, the diplomatic and strategic consequences would be devastating. The months of relationship building would be destroyed, and local cooperation with American forces would likely cease entirely. The group had moved approximately 50 meters toward the hardened bunkers when the attack took a new and terrifying turn. Explosions erupted from inside the base perimeter, indicating that infiltrators had penetrated the defensive lines during the confusion of the initial assault. The celebration area was now caught between external attackers and enemies who had somehow gotten inside the base. Sarah's tactical assessment became grimly clear. They were trapped in the middle of a coordinated assault designed specifically to eliminate the people she was supposed to protect. The safe route to the bunkers was now blocked by hostile forces, and staying in their current position would mean certain death as enemy fire converged on their location. "We can't reach the bunkers," she reported to Davis while returning fire toward muzzle flashes, visible near the base maintenance buildings. "Enemy forces have infiltrated the perimeter and were cut off from hardened positions." Davis nodded grimly, his own weapon now engaged against targets that seemed to be appearing from multiple directions. The base's defensive plan had been compromised, and they were facing a level of coordination that suggested extensive intelligence gathering and planning by their attackers. Governor Karzai approached Sarah during a brief lull in the incoming fire. Despite the chaos around him, his demeanor remained surprisingly calm, and his eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to danger. "Sergeant Martinez, what are our options?" he asked in heavily accented but clear English. "My security detail is dead, and we are clearly the primary target of this attack. If we remain here, we will all die. If we run, we will also die. What does your training tell you to do in this situation?" Sarah looked around at the tactical situation developing around them. American defensive positions were holding but barely, and enemy forces seemed to have unlimited ammunition and reinforcements. The celebration area offered minimal cover, and all the obvious routes to safety were blocked by hostile forces. But Sarah Martinez was a weapons specialist with 18 months of combat experience, and she had immediate access to some of the most advanced military equipment in the American arsenal. The weapons she had been demonstrating were still within reach, along with sufficient ammunition to conduct sustained operations. Her mind began calculating possibilities that went far beyond standard defensive tactics. If they couldn't reach safety by conventional means, perhaps they needed to create their own route using the full capability of American military technology. "Governor, I think we're going to have to fight our way out," she said, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "I have access to enough firepower to punch through enemy positions, but it's going to require moving through hostile territory to reach friendly lines." The celebration had become a battlefield, and Sarah Martinez was about to lead a group of dignitaries on a fighting withdrawal that would test every skill she had learned as a soldier. With enemy forces closing in from all directions, her full arsenal was about to become their only hope for survival. Celebration turned to chaos. When she arrived behind enemy lines with full arsenal, Sarah quickly assessed the weapons available from her demonstration display, while enemy fire intensified around their position. The M4 carbines would provide reliable firepower for the group's movement, but she needed something with more stopping power to break through enemy positions. Her eyes fell on the M249 squad automatic weapon that had been part of the display, exactly what she needed for suppressive fire. "Captain Nazir, can you handle one of these?" she asked, indicating an M4 while she grabbed the squad automatic weapon and several boxes of linked ammunition. "We're going to move in bounds toward the motor pool. The armored vehicles there might give us better protection and mobility." Nazir nodded grimly, checking the rifle's chamber with practiced movements that suggested extensive experience with similar weapons. Governor Karzai and the other Afghan officials gathered closer, their faces showing fear but also determination to follow whatever plan offered their best chance of survival. Lieutenant Colonel Davis was coordinating with base security over his radio, trying to vector friendly forces toward their position, but the tactical situation had deteriorated so rapidly that normal command and control structures were struggling to maintain awareness of developments across the base. All units, this is base command," came the voice over Davis's radio. "We have multiple breach points along the perimeter, and unknown number of infiltrators inside the wire. Friendlies are engaged in Sector 7, Sector 12, and Sector 15. Use extreme caution identifying targets." The radio traffic painted a picture of a base under assault from multiple directions, with American forces fighting desperate defensive actions while trying to identify and eliminate infiltrators who had penetrated their security. In this chaos, Sarah's small group would be largely on their own until they could reach a more defensible position. She shouldered the squad automatic weapon and checked her ammunition load one final time. The weapon was heavy but familiar. She had trained with it extensively and understood its capabilities. More importantly, its sustained fire capability would allow her to suppress enemy positions while the others moved, potentially creating the tactical advantage they needed to break through hostile lines. "Here's how we're going to do this," Sarah announced to the group, raising her voice to be heard over the continuing gunfire. "I'll provide suppressive fire while you move in pairs toward those concrete barriers about 30 meters ahead. When you reach cover, Captain Nazir will provide cover fire while I move up to join you. We'll continue this pattern until we reach the motor pool." The plan was basic infantry tactics, but in their current situation, basic tactics properly executed offered their best chance of survival. The key would be maintaining fire superiority while moving through territory that was increasingly controlled by hostile forces. Sarah opened fire with the squad automatic weapon, sending long bursts toward enemy muzzle flashes visible near the base facilities. The weapon's distinctive sound echoed across the celebration area as brass casings ejected in a steady stream. The suppressive fire had its intended effect. Incoming fire slackened noticeably as enemy fighters sought cover from her accurate bursts. "Move, move, move," she shouted, and Davis led the first pair of Afghan officials in a running sprint toward the concrete barriers. They reached cover successfully, and Captain Nazir immediately began returning fire with his M4, maintaining pressure on enemy positions while Sarah prepared for her own movement. The coordination worked perfectly for the first two bounds. Sarah's experience with the squad automatic weapon allowed her to maintain effective suppressive fire while conserving ammunition, and Captain Nazir proved to be an excellent marksman with the American rifle. The group was making steady progress toward the motor pool area, but as they approached the third set of barriers, the tactical situation changed dramatically. Enemy forces had apparently anticipated their movement and had positioned additional fighters along their route. When Sarah rose to provide cover for the next movement, she found herself facing a much heavier concentration of hostile fire than before. Bullets cracked past her position with increasing accuracy, and she realized that enemy marksmen were beginning to zero in on her location. The squad automatic weapon made her a high-priority target, and the longer she remained in one position, the more vulnerable she became to accurate enemy fire. "Contact front, heavy resistance," she called out while adjusting her own fire to engage the new threats. "They've reinforced the positions ahead of us. We need a different route or we're going to get pinned down here." Davis assessed their tactical situation while reloading his rifle. The motor pool still offered their best chance for finding armored protection, but the direct route was now clearly blocked by superior enemy forces. They needed to find an alternative approach that wouldn't expose them to the concentrated fire that was building in front of them. "What about moving through the maintenance area?" Davis suggested, pointing toward a cluster of buildings that would provide concealment from the main enemy positions. "If we can get behind those structures, we might be able to approach the motor pool from a different angle." Sarah studied the proposed route while continuing to engage targets with short, controlled bursts. The maintenance area offered better cover and concealment, but it also meant moving through unfamiliar terrain where enemy infiltrators might be waiting in ambush. It was a calculated risk, but their current position was becoming untenable as enemy fire continued to increase in volume and accuracy. Governor Karzai had remained remarkably calm throughout the firefight, but Sarah could see the strain beginning to show on his face and those of the other Afghan officials. They were civilians thrust into a combat situation, and their courage was admirable, but they lacked the training to sustain this level of stress indefinitely. "Governor, we're going to change direction toward those buildings," she explained quickly. "Stay low, move fast, and if anyone gets separated, keep moving toward the motor pool. Don't stop to help anyone else. The best way to help is to keep moving and draw enemy attention away from the group." The modified plan required crossing approximately 40 meters of open ground before reaching the cover of the maintenance buildings. It would be the most dangerous part of their movement so far, but staying in their current position was no longer viable as enemy forces continued to concentrate fire on their location. Sarah shifted the squad automatic weapon to a better firing position and prepared to lay down the heaviest suppressive fire she could manage. The weapon was designed for exactly this kind of situation, suppressing enemy positions while friendly forces maneuvered to more advantageous ground. On my signal, everyone moves together toward the maintenance buildings, she announced. No stopping, no looking back. I'll catch up once you're in cover. As she prepared to initiate what would be the most critical phase of their fighting withdrawal, Sarah Martinez realized that her weapons demonstration had become something she never anticipated. A real-world test of American military capability, conducted under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. The celebration had turned into chaos, and she was now operating behind enemy lines with her full arsenal, fighting for the survival of everyone depending on her skills and determination. Celebration turned to chaos. When she arrived behind enemy lines with full arsenal, Sarah opened fire with everything the squad automatic weapon could deliver, sending a continuous stream of rounds toward every enemy position she could identify. The sustained fire created exactly the suppression she needed. Hostile fire diminished significantly as enemy fighters dove for cover under her relentless barrage. Go, 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 she screamed over the weapon's thunderous report, and the entire group sprinted across the open ground toward the maintenance buildings. Davis and Captain Nazir flanked the Afghan officials, providing additional security while Sarah maintained her covering fire from the rear. The dash across open terrain felt like an eternity, but tactical training had prepared everyone for this kind of movement under fire. They reached the cover of the first maintenance building without casualties, though several bullet impacts on the concrete walls showed just how close they had come to disaster. Sarah ceased fire and immediately began her own movement toward the buildings. Carrying the squad automatic weapon and dragging an additional ammunition box she couldn't afford to leave behind. Enemy fire resumed as soon as her suppressive fire stopped, but she reached cover just as bullets began impacting the ground where she had been positioned. "Status report," she called out while checking each member of their group for injuries. Everyone appeared unharmed, though the stress of combat was clearly taking its toll on the Afghan officials who lacked military experience with this level of violence. Captain Nazir was examining the area around the maintenance buildings, looking for threats and opportunities that might affect their continued movement toward the motor pool. His tactical awareness had proven invaluable throughout their withdrawal, and Sarah was grateful to have such competent assistance in protecting the group. "Sergeant Martinez, I see movement in the building to our right," Nazir reported quietly. "Could be friendlies, but the tactical situation makes identification difficult. Should we attempt contact or assume hostile intent?" The question highlighted one of the most dangerous aspects of their current situation. With infiltrators inside the base perimeter and friendly forces engaged in combat throughout the area, distinguishing between allies and enemies had become extremely challenging. Making the wrong identification could result in friendly fire casualties or walking into an enemy ambush. Sarah decided to err on the side of caution. In their current situation, assuming hostile intent until proven otherwise offered the best chance of survival for the people depending on her leadership. We treat any unknown contacts as hostile until we can positively identify them as friendly, she decided. Our priority is getting these officials to safety, not clearing buildings or engaging in unnecessary firefights. Lieutenant Colonel Davis nodded his agreement while monitoring base communications on his radio. The tactical picture he was receiving painted an increasingly grim scenario of coordinated attacks that had stretched American defensive capabilities to their limits. "Base Command is reporting that the main gate area has been overrun," Davis informed the group grimly. "Enemy forces have established positions inside our perimeter and are calling for reinforcements from outside." This wasn't just an attack. It was a full-scale assault designed to capture the entire base. The implications were staggering. If enemy forces succeeded in overrunning the base, Sarah's group would find themselves completely surrounded with no hope of rescue or support. Their only chance would be to reach the motor pool, acquire armored transportation, and attempt to break through enemy lines to reach friendly territory. Governor Karzai approached Sarah while she was reloading the squad automatic weapon with fresh ammunition. Despite the chaos around them, his demeanor remained remarkably composed, and his eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had faced similar dangers before. "Sergeant Martinez, I must tell you something important," the governor said in his careful English. "This attack was not random. 3 days ago, my security chief received information about a possible threat against our meeting today. We thought American security would be sufficient protection, but it appears our enemies were better informed than we realized. Sarah looked at him sharply. Intelligence about a planned attack should have resulted in enhanced security measures or cancellation of the event entirely. If Afghan officials had prior warning, the question became why American forces hadn't been properly informed about the elevated threat level. "Governor, did you share this intelligence with American command?" she asked while scanning the area for immediate threats. "Because our briefings indicated minimal risk for today's event." Karzai's expression became pained, suggesting that communication between Allied forces had failed at a critical moment. "My security chief attempted to contact your intelligence officers yesterday, but I do not know if the information was properly transmitted. Perhaps there were problems with translation or urgency was not properly conveyed." The revelation explained much about the day's events. Enemy forces had conducted detailed reconnaissance and planning for an attack they knew would target high-value Afghan officials during an American-hosted event. The coordination and timing of the assault made perfect sense if the attackers had advanced knowledge of the celebration schedule and participants, but understanding the enemy's advantages didn't improve their immediate tactical situation. They were still trapped behind enemy lines with limited ammunition and no clear route to safety. The motor pool remained their best option for acquiring protected transportation, but reaching it would require crossing additional open ground while enemy forces continued to strengthen their positions. Sarah made a command decision that would commit them to their most dangerous move yet. "We're going to make one final push to the motor pool," she announced to the group. "I'll use the last of my heavy ammunition to suppress their positions while everyone moves together. Once we reach the vehicles, we don't stop for anything except mechanical failure." She checked her remaining ammunition for the squad automatic weapon, enough for perhaps 2 more extended firing sequences before she would be reduced to rifle fire only. It would have to be sufficient to get them across the final stretch of hostile terrain. The maintenance buildings had provided temporary safety, but Sarah could hear enemy voices getting closer as hostile forces continued to reinforce their positions throughout the base. Time was running out, and their window for reaching the motor pool was closing rapidly. "Everyone ready?" she asked, receiving nods from the group despite the fear visible in their eyes. "Remember, no stopping once we start moving. The vehicles are our only chance to get out of here alive." As Sarah prepared for what might be their final tactical movement, she realized that her role had evolved far beyond anything covered in military training. She was no longer just a weapons specialist. Providing fire support, she had become the leader of a desperate fighting withdrawal that would determine whether any of them survived the celebration that had turned into the deadliest chaos of her military career. The motor pool was less than 100 meters away, but it might as well have been 100 miles given the enemy forces positioned between their current location and safety. With her full arsenal reduced to whatever ammunition remained, Sarah Martinez prepared to lead the most important mission of her life. Celebration turned to chaos. When she arrived behind enemy lines with full arsenal, Sarah positioned herself at the corner of the maintenance building, the squad automatic weapon ready for what she knew would be her final sustained barrage. The motor pool was visible across a stretch of open ground that offered no cover except for a few scattered concrete barriers. Enemy muzzle flashes were clearly visible from multiple positions between their location and the vehicles they desperately needed to reach. "This is it," she announced to the group, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "When I start firing, everyone runs directly toward those Humvees. Don't look back, don't stop if someone falls. The only way any of us survives is if we reach those vehicles." Lieutenant Colonel Davis positioned himself to provide additional covering fire with his M4, while Captain Nazir checked his ammunition one final time. Governor Karzai gathered the other Afghan officials, speaking quietly to them in Dari, probably explaining the desperate nature of their situation and the courage that would be required in the next few minutes. Sarah took a deep breath and opened fire with everything the squad automatic weapon could deliver. The sustained burst was deafening, sending rounds toward every enemy position she could identify. The weapon's bipod helped control the recoil as she traversed from target to target, creating a wall of suppressive fire that forced enemy fighters to seek immediate cover. "Move," she screamed over the weapon's thunderous report, and the entire group burst from cover in a desperate sprint toward the motor pool. Davis and Nazir flanked the Afghan officials, their rifles adding to Sarah's suppressive fire whenever they could manage aimed shots while running. The dash across open ground became a nightmare of incoming fire and near misses. Bullets cracked past the running figures with increasing accuracy. As enemy fighters recovered from Sarah's initial suppression and began engaging the moving targets. One of the Afghan officials stumbled but regained his footing, continuing the sprint with determination that impressed everyone around him. Sarah's ammunition belt fed through the weapon in a continuous stream of brass casings and muzzle flashes. She could feel the barrel heating up from sustained fire, but stopping to change barrels would mean certain death for everyone depending on her covering fire. The weapon had to hold together for just a few more seconds. Governor Karzai reached the first Humvee and immediately began trying to start the engine, while the others provided security around the vehicle. The armored truck had been positioned with its engine running as part of the base's emergency procedures, but combat damage or mechanical issues could still prevent their escape. Davis reached the vehicle second and immediately began checking for keys and operational status. Military vehicles were designed to be started quickly in emergency situations, but the chaos of battle could affect even the most reliable systems. Sarah's weapon finally ran out of ammunition just as the last members of their group reached the motor pool. She abandoned the squad automatic weapon and sprinted toward the Humvee, drawing her sidearm to provide what protection she could during the final moments of their withdrawal. Enemy fire intensified dramatically as hostile forces realized their targets were about to escape. Bullets impacted the Humvee's armored body with metallic clangs that testified to the vehicle's protective capabilities, but the engine compartment and tires remained vulnerable to well-placed shots. "Engines running," Davis shouted from the driver's seat as Sarah dove into the vehicle's rear compartment. "Everyone in, we're moving now." The Humvee lurched forward just as enemy fighters began concentrating their fire on the vehicle itself. The armored glass showed spiderweb cracks from bullet impacts, but the protection held as Davis accelerated toward the base's main gate area. But their escape route presented a new problem. Base communications had reported that enemy forces had overrun the main gate, which meant driving directly into hostile-controlled territory. They would have to fight their way through enemy positions to reach friendly lines, using only the vehicle's armor and their remaining ammunition. "Contact front," Captain Nazir called out from the passenger seat, pointing toward muzzle flashes near the gate area. "Multiple positions engaging from prepared positions. They're waiting for us." Sarah assessed their tactical situation through the Humvee's small windows. Enemy forces had indeed prepared an ambush position covering the main gate, probably anticipating that any survivors would attempt to escape using base vehicles. The trap was well planned and positioned to maximize damage to any vehicle attempting to break through. But Sarah Martinez had 18 months of combat experience and access to the Humvee's mounted weapons system. The vehicle was equipped with a .50 caliber machine gun that could punch through most defensive positions, and she had the training to use it effectively even under these desperate circumstances. "Governor, everyone stay down and hold on," she announced while climbing toward the weapon mount. "We're going to punch through their positions using the .50 cal. This is going to be loud and violent, but it's our only way out." The Humvee's mounted machine gun represented the final element of Sarah's full arsenal. She had demonstrated small arms and squad weapons during the celebration, but the heavy machine gun was the kind of firepower that could break enemy defensive positions and create the opening they needed to escape. Davis accelerated directly toward the gate, while Sarah opened fire with the mounted weapon. The .50 caliber rounds tore through enemy positions with devastating effect, sending hostile fighters scrambling for cover as their defensive line began to collapse under the heavy fire. The Humvee smashed through the gate area at high speed, taking fire from multiple directions but maintaining momentum through the enemy ambush. Sarah continued engaging targets with the heavy machine gun until they were clear of the immediate threat area, finally allowing herself to believe they might actually survive. 20 minutes later, they reached the nearest American forward operating base, where medical teams and intelligence officers were waiting to debrief them about the attack. The base they had left behind was still under assault, but reinforcements were already en route to retake the facility and evacuate any remaining survivors. Governor Karzai approached Sarah as medics checked everyone for injuries. His composed demeanor had finally cracked slightly, revealing the strain of their ordeal. But his eyes held genuine gratitude and respect. "Sergeant Martinez, "You saved all our lives today," he said simply. "Your courage and skill turned what should have been our deaths into survival. I will not forget what you did for us." Sarah looked back toward the base they had escaped, where smoke still rose from the continuing battle. The celebration had indeed turned to chaos, but her training, her weapons, and her determination had carried them through. The deadliest situation of her military career, the weapons, demonstration she had prepared so carefully that morning, had become a real-world test of American military capability, conducted under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. When she arrived behind enemy lines with her full arsenal, Sarah Martinez had proven that superior training, superior equipment, and superior determination could overcome even the most carefully planned enemy attack. The celebration was over. But Sarah Martinez had written a new chapter in her military career that would be remembered long after the chaos had ended.